Thank you, Stephen. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here tonight and to have been invited to participate in this, what I hope and think will be an extraordinary adventure and a really important component in our efforts to improve the outcomes for the students that we know are currently struggling. I also want to thank Jennifer sincerely for her editing. For the document that you read, if it reads reasonably well, you can thank Jennifer. If you find errors, you can blame me. I want to talk about why education should embrace research. To some degree, these topics have already been mentioned, and I'd like to go just into a little more depth. We've seen quite a number of enterprises, professions and industries that have adopted evidence-based as their rationale for practice. Most of those successful enterprises have been the ones that have done that. There seems to be a link between the two. And for example, in my own experience of teaching psychology students, it was evident in the early 90s that psychology, in particular clinical psychology, was a bit of a mishmash of approaches. We had Freud, we had humanists like Rogers, and we had behaviourists, and each of them appeared to have similar evidence levels. At least they were taught as though they did. And then gradually we began to see evidence arising that a particular approach that was a cognitive behavioural approach to clinical psychology was far outstripping any other approach in terms of its effectiveness for people with mental health difficulties. And now the students, or until my relatively recent retirement, the students these days have become so entrenched in the notion of evidence-based practice that they can't imagine a time when it wasn't the norm. And my hope is that at some stage in education, the students in tertiary education will have the same attitude that how could it have been otherwise? Surely we should be engaging in research and we should be adopting research as the major component of our teaching practice. And in particular, it applies to those students who struggle. One of the comments that's been made about the current system is that it's a fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants system. Just as doctors did years ago, teachers these days have little or fewer resources than their initial teacher training, which has some concerns about it. Their limited observation of colleagues and their own personal experience. There is a whole wealth of evidence out there that could enhance teacher practice if it were made available to those teachers. One of the outcomes that was commented upon by John Fleming from he's the Deputy Chair of the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, was that unfortunately for a lot of teachers have been choosing their own adventure. Not necessarily because they would like to, but that is about all that they have available to them. As Jennifer mentioned, our past efforts haven't been very fruitful. It's not for want of money. Our funding for education has always been good, but productivity has not kept pace over time. And we haven't necessarily spent our money on aspects of education that have been beneficial in the broad scale, in particular shortening class sizes by a few numbers, by 5, say, in a class of 30, has relatively little impact, but it is hugely expensive for an education system. The part that's missing when you shorten or reduce class sizes is that the teaching continues to be the same teaching that was taking place with groups of 30. So if one is going to reduce class sizes. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but it must be accompanied by an improvement in the way in which the teaching process is assigned. And finally, we don't routinely evaluate our introduced programs, which is a dreadful indictment on the history of educational policy making. It's led to the continuation, adoption of programs like whole language we've seen, the 3 queuing system. There's a whole host of fads and some cases scams that have been adopted over the years, partly as a consequence of our failure to evaluate. So one of the things that I would expect would happen would be we'd have a reduction in the number of these fads that are introduced, the pendulum swings, if you like. There is a huge variation amongst teachers in terms of their effectiveness. One finding is that a teacher who is at the 90th percentile in effectiveness can cover for the class in 6 months what a teacher at the 10th percentile can cover in a whole year. So why is teacher variation so extreme? I believe, and the research tends to support the fact that it's this seat of the pants flying that leads to such dramatic differences between teacher effectiveness. Policy development then and teacher education are continuously being highlighted as crucial. There have been a number of important research reports. The National Reading Panel, from which the title 5 from 5 derives, ultimately, was probably the single most important report on literacy. There had been others during the 80s and 90s, but this one just seemed to strike a chord. And there were other reports that are noted there, such as ours in 2005. Unfortunately, it was never adopted, and it still sits there as a pillar of what we might be able to achieve were we to adopt the recommendations, but so far that's not been the case. The Rose report, which led to quite significant change in the US, was also an important improvement. And more recently, the National Early Literacy Program began to talk about intervention at very early stages. One of the outcomes of the adoption of programs and approaches has been that teachers no longer feel they have to wing it. It's been the case in other professions too, that when they have protocols, approaches that they can rely on, they no longer feel quite so alone and quite so desperate to have to try one thing after another. The similarity of assertions in these reports, learning to read isn't natural. Stephen mentioned that. All children can master it though. It's a very interesting field. There's been some really fascinating research in the last few years in neuroscience where using MRIs and similar imaging approaches, it's possible to see what parts of the brain light up when someone reads. And when skilled readers are reading, there is a particular part of the left hemisphere that lights up. When children are learning to read and are beginning to decode well, there's another part of the brain that lights up. When children who are not doing well and adults who don't read well are given similar imaging techniques, we find that most of the activity occurs in the right side of the brain, which is a very interesting outcome because it tends to cement the notion that the way in which we read is similar despite all of our differences. And the way in which we are taught to read should be the way that enhances these processes within the brain, these left-sided processes. That sometimes has been called neuronal recycling because it involves parts of the brain that aren't dedicated to reading. We have no such part of the brain dedicated to reading. The history is far too short for evolution to have made an impact in that regard. But the parts of the brain that have some similarities in their evolved activity can be used. And this is what happens with reading. For example, in the occipitotemporal part of the brain, which is where we do skilled whole word reading, it's amazing how that seems to work because of the segment of the brain that was originally designed for lines, intersection of lines, and facial recognition. That's not so far in terms of the intersection of lines from what reading involves, seeing how letters are constructed. And so that part of the brain is the one that is relatively easily recruited in order to enhance skilled reading. The other points there, neither biology nor SES. There have been times when it's been thought that either of those is sufficient to, that is, a biology that is not easily adapted to reading, or those from low SES areas. There have been excuses that those can preclude children from learning to read, but we are learning that that isn't the case. And the effects of teaching, which is the only thing we are able to control within education. There are certainly other influences, but the effects of teaching we can control, and powerful effects are possible. At the same time, we can have minimal effects when the teaching isn't appropriate. So the National Reading Panel, as Jennifer outlined, covered these 5 areas. We need to systematically and explicitly teach children, which has been mentioned before. The National Reading Panel looked at 100,000 different studies in order to come up with these findings. It's important for children to be able to break apart and manipulate sounds. So how many sounds can you, as an audience, how many sounds can you hear in the spoken word pitch? You might be able to hear 3 sounds or 4 sounds, but 3 is correct. The t is silent in the spoken word pitch. What remains when you remove the k from the spoken word pink? Do you get ping or pin? One of the issues as adults is that when we are given these phonemic tasks, we tend to rely on spelling. And that makes it difficult for us to be able to teach children how to begin to rely on the sounds of our language. So training is very important. Phonics is really phonemic awareness with letters introduced, written letters. So having learned how to blend sounds together, when sounds are represented by alphabetic letters, children are in a better position to be able to blend those to form words. Practicing reading aloud with feedback. When we have fluency, that is when children can read at quite a rapid rate and still retain comprehension, the reason they are able to retain comprehension is because once they master the decoding strategies and begin to become skilled at saying what's on the page, it becomes an effortless process rather than a laborious process. And so they are able to make sense of what they read much more readily than when they were struggling. Children need vocabulary sufficient for them to learn to make sense of what they read. So some children naturally do this. They interrogate the text, if you like. They might skim what they're reading. They might predict what's coming up. They might visualise a scene or summarise, and that helps with their comprehension. But other children are much more passive and need assistance with that area. So the 5 different areas are each important. The difference between explicit and systematic. Explicit means I know how to do this and I'll teach you how. I won't simply give clues or leave you to your own devices. I'll show you. We'll do it together, then you'll do it. I'll keep helping and observing your efforts, correcting any errors, and I'll give you practice till you've mastered it, until it's there in long-term memory. Explicit comes from the Latin explicare, to disentangle, to explain. And that's the consequence where explicit instruction is delivered to students who struggle especially, that it becomes much more readily learned. Systematic means basically that you've already prepared what it is you're going to teach, that you've broken the task down from simple to complex, that you teach them in a sequential order, and you provide sufficient examples for them to be mastered and sufficient practice as well. When that sort of teaching is part of one's approach, the findings back in 2000 were improved early word recognition, spelling and reading comprehension. SES levels were not necessarily a hindrance. The approach was most effective for those who don't easily learn by the smell of an oily rag, those who do need help in order to learn to read. And it's most effective when it's introduced early. Since then, the Rose Report highlighted the importance of a difference between synthetic and analytic approaches to phonics. The National Reading Panel didn't have enough evidence back in those days as to which was necessarily better than the other. But a synthetic approach means you actually you build up from small beginnings. So you teach the letter sound correspondences in a clearly defined incremental sequence, and you teach children to blend phonemes in correct order in order to read the word. We saw an example of that in the video, the initial video. Common terms that you may come across in the various recommendations of the different reports that I've mentioned. I've covered those as best I can. I haven't talked about early screening of phonemic awareness and letter sound, letter name, but that does appear in the article. Evidence-based initial instruction for all has been shown to be beneficial, not only for those who are struggling, but for all. We need to incorporate frequent progress monitoring. We're talking here about curriculum-based measures of approximately 1 minute per child, taken every 2 to 3 weeks to ensure that progress is appropriate. And if progress isn't appropriate, then we look at more intensive interventions in addition to the regular program. And again, we know that improved teacher training is required. The future, well, the future is 10 years old. The National Inquiry came up with some very strong and appropriate recommendations. Unfortunately, as yet, it hasn't shown itself at the classroom level. I said at the beginning, this is an exciting time to be alive. At least I intended to say it. But then I realised it had already been said not so long ago. But I do think it potentially is a most exciting time to be alive. For the first time, we've had the results of some years of national and international assessments that tell us how well we're doing as a nation. Up until recently, we didn't know that. We had small-scale reports, we had some state testing, but now we're constantly getting results about how our nation is going in the area of reading development. We've seen significant areas of need, as Jennifer highlighted. With these reports, the media has jumped on those reports. And whenever there's some bad news around, of course, the media lets us know all about it. This has an impact on parents, as you can imagine. Parent concern is always of concern to policymakers, to politicians. So we're starting to see, I think, not just a groundswell, but a national swell towards looking more intensely at our system and what can be done to improve it. At the same time as this is happening, we also have a number of areas of research, not just educational research, but contributions from cognitive psychology, speech pathology, neuroscience, all focusing in on a similar area and publishing widely. Evidence-based practice in literacy is not easy, but it's doable and it's on the radar. Existing teacher education programs are a stumbling block, but there are signs of reform. I've been pleased to see some reports of some interesting and potentially effective approaches to literacy in New South Wales. And for the first time, I think, in my career involved in literacy, I'm feeling rather optimistic about the future. I imagine the Minister will address us further on what's happening in New South Wales. Thank you.